Okay, welcome back, everyone, to the Natural Awakening podcast. This is me, your host, Wiston, and today our subject that I'm interviewing is the researcher academic D. Osto. D has recently completed and is about to publish a book, Paranormal States, investigating paranormal phenomena, the so-called Siddhi or Iddhi, the supernormal powers within contemporary practitioners and kind of Buddhist folklore, which is a neglected area of research, in my opinion. Regardless of whatever you believe about their ontological status, these experiences happen and are kind of neglected or pushed aside, marginalized. And I'm glad that someone has brought more of it into the spotlight with a critical and balanced academic lens. So thanks for doing that, Dee. And for those who aren't familiar with you or your work, could you say a little bit about yourself, who you are, excuse me, and maybe just a brief primer on the book?
Yeah, sure. Well, my name is D. Osto, formerly Douglas Osto, but now I go by D. Osto. And I am a researcher, academic, who's been teaching philosophy and religion at Massey University in Palmerston North in New Zealand for the last 19 years. My particular area of interest is in Buddhist studies. My original work was on Indian Mahayana Buddhism, so that was a very kind of philological approach. And then over time, I've kind of moved into more contemporary aspects of Buddhism. I wrote a book on Buddhism and psychedelics that people might be familiar with called Altered States, Buddhism and Psychedelic Spirituality in America. I branched out a bit. I've done some research on Hinduism. I wrote a book on non-dual Shaivism, the contemporary revival of non-dual Shaivism most recently, and then I've done this book on paranormal states. So yeah, I think that's kind of me in a nutshell. Um, yeah. So, was there anything? Did you think I needed to add anything to that, or does that sound all right to you?
No. That's a great complete introduction.
Cool.
So first off, what demotivated you to move into this kind of research? I mean, just from your little resume there of your previous work, you were already kind of
Yep.
interested. It's in the psychedelic at that
Yep.
intersection
Yep.
with the Mahayana. And that has very visionary elements. I know you're interested in the Avatamsaka Sutra, and part
Yep.
of that in your own research, as I have been in my own practice and study.
Yep.
Maybe for those who don't know, what is the Avatamsaka Sutra? This would be a fun aside for people,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
a good kind
Sure.
of intro, maybe into
Intro to stuff. Yeah, right. And I think it's
this
very
space.
important too. I think for sort of understanding kind of my orientation and how I kind of approach Buddhism and altered states and even the paranormal is that the Avatamsaka is the flower. It's often translated as a flower ornament scripture. There's an English translation of it from the Chinese by Thomas Cleary. It's a very long Mahayana sutra. It's about 1,500 pages in English translation. Originally from India, it no longer exists in Sanskrit, but there are parts of it that exist in Sanskrit. It's really a compilation of probably earlier sutras, and the two most important are the Dashabhumika Sutra, which is the 10 stages of the Bodhisattva, and then the Gandhavyuha Sutra, which is becomes the final section of the flower ornament scripture. And Gandhavyuha I translate as the Supreme Array scripture, which other people translate differently. But it was really the Supreme Array that I've spent maybe 20 plus years researching. I got interested in it when I was a divinity student at Harvard. Um, and basically because it's a very visionary text, and it's a story of this young man's quest for enlightenment in ancient India, and he visits 52 different spiritual guides, and they describe and impart all these visions to him about the interpenetration of all time and space, and it's very cosmic and very psychedelic, and I was kind of enthralled by it from the mid 90s, and I ended up doing uh, an MA thesis on it at the University of Washington when I did another master's in Asian languages and literature, and then I went on to do a PhD on it at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and then I published my first book on it, which is called Power, Wealth, and Women in Indian Mahayana Buddhism. And this really kind of taking a kind of new historicism approach where I looked at different themes about power and wealth and the role of women, and I related them to the Indian context when I think the text was composed. So it was very much, from that historical text critical point of view. But then, as time went on, I got interested in this idea of what is the relationship between psychedelics and Mahayana Buddhism and altered states of consciousness, and so that those questions led me into two directions. One of them was to look at the origins of the Mahayana, possibly in visionary experiences, and then also look at what is the overlap in the relationship between psychedelics and then the visionary experiences in these sutras, and how there was this confluence beginning in the 50s and really kicking off in the 1960s in America, of the introduction of Buddhism and the introduction of very powerful psychedelic substances such as LSD, um, and psilocybin and such. So that led to my Altered States book, and then I don't. How's that kind of for an intro? I can keep going. I'll go into then explain why I got into interested in the paranormal, if that works.
Yeah.
Um,
No, that's
yeah.
that's a great intro. I mean, I remember in the introduction of the book, you kind of related the kind of standard late Mahayana model, which includes this image or this expectation of a Buddha or a Bodhisattva as a
Mhm.
being possessed of a full suite of supernatural powers. So,
Mm.
which may not have been so prevalent within the early tradition, although certainly within the early tradition there is also that. There's discussion of the Iddhi, the development of the supernormal powers. Certain figures within the early Buddhist Sangha are singled out as having developed them to a great degree. The Buddha himself, likewise,
Mhm.
was kind of like the supreme magician as well as everything else.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, definitely. Just on a technical issue, my connection is fairly unstable, so I keep getting a little thing that says like uploading and things like that. So if things are going well with us, is that I just want to make sure that we're not, just talking to ourselves the whole time. Yeah, it's
I
like something
yeah,
that says trying to reconnect.
we're
Make
not
sure you
just
have a.
talking to ourselves. So one thing one thing I like about this recording platform is that
Hmm.
even if the connection drops or is a little spotty between us,
Yep.
the recording quality that will actually come out will be fine because it's like doing it locally on your end and locally on my end, and then it stitches it together
Ah,
so that regardless
awesome.
of the
Yeah.
connection quality between us,
So as long
it'll
as
be
we're
stitched
as long
together
as we're
at the
getting
end.
that real time, then yeah, okay, that's great. Because I was worried because it's happened before. I've done
Yeah,
entire interviews which were like,
yeah,
wow,
yeah.
that was really awesome, and then nothing. Yeah, yeah. Well, no, that's a good
That was
point.
a great interview, and yeah, no. So this it'll all come out clean and pristine at the end.
Okay, awesome. Good to know. Sorry, listeners, for that digression. Maybe you could cut out the technical that bit. Um, yeah, and good point.
Yeah,
Yes, and so
or
there
leave it
is
in,
that.
whatever.
Or leave it in, yeah, if people want to listen to it. And I think yes, that is absolutely true, and that was part of my interest. Was what is the role of the paranormal in traditional Buddhism? But let me, I think I'll loop around to that and first talk about why I decided to do this particular book. Was well, there's a couple reasons. I think that the real impetus was I read this little book called Mind Beyond Brain, Buddhism, Science, and the Paranormal. And it is a book that was by Columbia University Press, and it's an excellent little book. And it was done by some people who work at the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, which is a kind of think tank at the University of Virginia that was put together by Ian Stevenson, who some of you might know was very famous for his studies on children who have spontaneously recollect memories of past lives. And so Ian Stevenson was I think he was a psychiatrist actually, but got very interested in the paranormal, and particularly children kind of spontaneously having these memories of past lives. And so he was able to put together this team. And so since the 60s, they've been collecting data, not just on children who have memories of past lives, but all various other types of paranormal phenomena. So telepathy, telekinesis, and apparitional activities and things like that. And so they wrote this little book, and it was basically it kind of foregrounded their research in their particular area of expertise, and it was kind of sort of inspired by a workshop that they did with a Bon master from Tibet. But their understanding of Buddhism was pretty superficial, and it was fairly one-dimensional. And as someone that does Buddhist studies, I was kind of disappointed that that there wasn't more Buddhism there. And so, and this has happened to me more than once, where I think, well, wouldn't it be great if there were a book where it took this look at the paranormal, but what from a more humanities point of view, and really took a deep dive into the Buddhist tradition. I thought, I know, I'll write that. I'll write that book. And I think so that
You have the background for that, yeah.
yeah, so I have the background for that, so why not write it? And and more than that, I've been interested in the paranormal for a long time, and there were two reasons for that. One of them is personal, and then the other was through my research. So I'll start with the research part. Is when I was researching my Altered States book, a number of people recounted paranormal experiences to me that were not induced through psychedelics, and some of them were, but some of them were either completely spontaneous or induced through meditation. And so this really wasn't the point of my research. I did mention a few instances in Altered States, but it got me thinking, because when you're a researcher and you have a university affiliation and you talk to people and you're protecting their anonymity, they will tend to tell you things that they might not tell you otherwise, and the same with the paranormal. And what I realized is that maybe these kind of things happen a lot more often than we think they do. And one example that really stood out for me in Altered States was I was at a conference and presented a paper on this, a Buddhist Studies conference. And afterwards, just having drinks with my fellow Buddhist Studies people. And there was, I started talking to someone who's a very well-established scholar of Tibetan Buddhism. And they were saying how, when they were a PhD student and they were in Nepal and they were doing this very intense sadhana to the goddess Tara, at several days into it, Tara just appeared, and she told him all these things that were going to happen to him, who he would marry, the children he would have, what their names would be, and all of those things came true. And so I was like, okay, so where do you put that? And I and
Those things
I've
do
learned.
happen sometimes.
Yeah, and I've learned that I don't, without having an approach where I'm just like, I'm a very empathic person, and I've learned just not really to prejudge anything. And he's a very intelligent person, very well established in the field, well published, well respected, and this is what they're telling me. So why shouldn't I believe you know what they're saying? And so I was like, okay, that's,
Sure.
and it's interesting because there's this kind of contemporary, there's the paradigm of physicalism, has it's sort of infiltrated the humanities, and we take a very constructivist, often
Right.
in humanities people take a very constructivist view of things, where we need to explain away things like this in terms of either society or culture or psychology or
Artifacts of
whatever.
culture and linguistics, or
Yeah,
psychopathology, something.
psychopathology, right? Because these things, because there's this kind of and this is where the dogmatism comes in, right? Where there's this kind of faulty logic where these things can't happen, so they don't happen, right? And so that is
Right.
by
It's
definition
like,
that is
well,
not,
hold
yeah,
on.
that's not empiricism, that's not science, because you're already deciding a priori what is possible and what is not
Right.
possible. And so if this isn't possible, then it needs to be explained away. And so, yeah, so that was a very dramatic example for me. And then there were also things that happened in my life from a rather young age, that I couldn't really explain either. And so I was intrigued, and I thought, okay, well, why don't I write a book about like contemporary, and this is, I very much took over the approach that I use with altered states. So in my book on altered states, I spend some time talking about altered states in the Buddhist tradition, particularly like in Indian Buddhism, because that's my area of expertise, and in Mahayana. And then I kind of take a historical overview of Buddhism and psychedelics in America, and then I put together an online survey of people, which they could fill out, and then I followed up that survey with interviews. And so that was all original data that I then incorporated into this kind of historical approach. And so I thought, okay, I'll do the same thing with the paranormal. I'll have a chapter devoted to the paranormal in Indian Buddhism. Then I'll have a chapter devoted to kind of the Western kind of scientific study of the paranormal, and then I'll use data that I got from an online survey and interviews to look at specific um, contemporary, I call them contemporary tales or contemporary stories of the paranormal, and I kind of divide them at that point in the later chapters by topics. So I look at things like telepathy, and precognition, encounters with other beings, things like that. And then there were two of my interviewees just had rather detailed and interesting stories to tell, and so I thought, instead of just picking out kind of anecdotal events and then just kind of throwing them out there, I would do a kind of life narrative for each of them, and look at the role
Hmm.
of the paranormal throughout their life, and the role that it plays within the kind of the trajectory
Yeah.
of their lives. That's I that's what I did for the last two chapters. I have one that's devoted to Rick Rapetti, who is a scholar of, is
Former
actually a
guest on this
philosopher.
podcast. You can check that one out
Yes,
in
yep,
the.
there you go. You can check that one out. Very lovely, interesting, intelligent person. Yeah, so I will definitely plug that. Going to listen to Rick. So, and we had an immediate rapport, and so we did several hours of interviewing. Um, and then Kat Smith, which is a pseudonym, but someone who lives in New Zealand, who also from a very young age has had paranormal experiences. So I devoted a chapter each to them, and then I kind of had a summing up, and then I have a kind of, like I did in Altered States, I kind of have an autobiographical postscript where I talk about some of my own experiences. So that was kind of the idea for it. And I think, having done the Altered States book, and then after that I did the book on non-dual Shaivism, where I more or less used the same methodology of looking at historical stuff and then doing, I didn't really have an online interview for that one, but I did do the more kind of auto ethnographic stuff and interviewing people on the ground. So I was very much uh, I really shifted from this kind of very textual approach to a more contemporary approach, because I found working with like real life people quite fascinating, and also and human beings are so complex and also even contradictory. Texts, we kind of,
Right.
they're kind of forced to be consistent in a certain way, and then we can impose a consistency on them, where people are a lot more complex and nuanced, and it kind of looking at kind of spirituality on the ground, I think is a really valuable thing to do. And then also, because I have this kind of historical mindset, I like to look at how um, how did these ideas evolve, like genealogies of ideas, and how did these practices evolve, and then how they are incorporated into a kind of contemporary practice by real life people into their understanding. So yeah, and I was really happy to get Columbia to publish it again, and they were very light on the editing. So pretty much what's coming out is pretty much as I wrote it, and that feels really good. Yeah, I'm kind of really happy with the result, and I hope people like it when it does when it does come out.
Which is next month. Remind me of the date so people know.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
think
I'll
that I
put
think
links
the
and so
10th.
on for people
I
to
think
pre-order.
10th of
The
September. I
10th.
think official. Yeah, you can pre-order it now,
Yeah.
um, either through
And I've been
The
reading the
Columbia
proofs. I
website.
recommend it.
Yeah, there you go. Recommends it. And you're in there too. It's not a huge part, but yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I'm an
So
interview
yeah,
subject in there.
yeah.
I
So
I, I show up.
full disclosure, he's in there too. So yeah, no, was there any? Yeah, so I think that kind of gives a sort of general overview of the
A good
project. And
overview. Yeah.
yeah,
A little more into detail. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the phenomenological orientation, both within classical Buddhism and then how that interfaces with your research method here, and kind of how you presented things and how you interviewed people. I know in the introduction you kind of wove threads together in a really nice way between Maurice Merleau-Ponty and the 20th century phenomenology, and also Yogacara Buddhism, Madhyamaka. Um, so maybe you could just say a little bit about classical Buddhist phenomenology and how that intersects with this research today.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think some of this, well, pretty obviously is connected to Dan Lusthouse's work on Buddhist phenomenology, and how he interprets Yogacara as a Buddhist phenomenology, which is controversial for some people who kind of see it more as a kind of metaphysical idealism. But I studied as an undergrad with Dan for a year at Grinnell, and obviously had a big impact on me. I mean, if anybody has a problem with me being in Buddhist studies, you can blame Dan for it, because because when I studied with him when I was a sophomore as an undergrad, that's when I was 20, and I decided I'm going to get my PhD in Buddhist studies, and I'm gonna teach and research this. And so I did. So obviously he was a major influence on me. But I've also, because I don't Buddhist philosophy isn't really my area, but just kind of keep myself alive in the academy with the decline of kind of religious studies abroad and at my university. I kind of shifted many years ago over from religion to doing Asian philosophy. But I've always been interested in Madhyamaka and studying Madhyamaka, different interpretations of Madhyamaka, and what emptiness is, and not as much with Yogacara. But I think Dan had all kind of instilled in me from quite an early age that a real powerful and useful way of looking at Madhyamaka is anti-metaphysical. That's what emptiness means, the lack of essence. And so if things lack an essence, we can't, metaphysics is all about getting down to first principles. But, if you accept this idea of dependent arising in its most radical formulation of Madhyamaka, that, even, all theoretical truth is only going to be relatively true. And so any type of metaphysics is in some sense an overreach in the sense of like if you want to come up with some kind of first principles that just are things in and of themselves, it's kind of a direct contradiction to this idea of emptiness. And then you, if you look at Yogacara, then from this kind of more phenomenological lens, less from a metaphysical point of view, you can kind of make that argument too. And then this is when I draw in with Merleau-Ponty's idea of the life world is this idea that, you know, in some sense there's an immediacy to our experience that you know, goes beyond, you know, this kind of abstraction into subjects and objects, and abstraction into kind of metaphysics, and it eschews this kind of either naive realism or this kind of the scientific objectivism, that there is a real objective world out there that we can somehow have access to. And what this does is it kind of points out that you know, um, meaning and interpretation and human emotion and physical objects, you know, in the world, like mugs and tables and chairs and buildings and planets and things like that, they're all kind of entangled and implicated, you know, in each other, in this life world. And so um, and I think this is a very useful approach to the paranormal, because I think, and I talk about this, that, you know, in some ways paranormal is a problematic term. It's a fairly new term, and it's kind of a catch-all term. It's a bit of a blunt instrument, and the way that it's kind of used is like weird things that we can't really explain. All right, that's in our culture we call
Right.
paranormal, right? So
Right.
but what it does is, by taking a kind of phenomenological approach, is what I aim for is a kind of thick description, focusing on the kind of narratives, like, okay, well, talking to people and then they tell stories, listening to their stories, and then relaying those stories, and not sort of passing judgment whether this is necessarily true or not true, or possible or not possible. And I basically say that, you know, in the real world, we have no certitude. All we have is that things are more or less probable, and we'll make those decisions based on our own prior, you know, presuppositions about, you know, what reality is and our prior experience and things like that. And so rather, you know, than being heavy-handed and saying, you know, this is a delusion, this is real, you know, this can't be true or anything like that, just listening and relating the stories, and bracketing out those things, and letting, you know, let the reader decide. And so I think in that way, you know, if you are a complete skeptic and you read this book, you know, even if you are just interested in kind of the sociology of contemporary religious, you know, practice,
Exactly.
you'd get a lot out of it, right? You don't need to believe it. The book doesn't require any prior belief. Or if you are 100% all in with, you know, with a psychic phenomena and the paranormal, then that's great too. So and so that I kind of take that lens, and I think that and also because I am a Buddhist, I think that it kind of, and I kind of want to blur that line between emic and etic, you know, insider outsider. So I think that there's quite a bit in Buddhism that you could advocate is very phenomenological, even going back to the time of the Buddha. You know, the Buddha, you know, and there's famous analogy of the raft, that, you know, the teaching is just for crossing over, or the you know, the unanswerable questions. All these things seem to point to, you know, the Buddha. And, you know, the Buddha talked about the world as in this, you know, fathom length frame. So
Right.
there, and if
The
even if
origination
you
of the
look,
cosmos,
yeah,
the cessation of the
with
cosmos
in
in
this,
this body.
in the skandhas, the heaps, the aggregates,
Yeah.
that's everything. And that's very phenomenological, because there's no hard and fast line between rupa, you know, between form and between sensation and
Right.
perception, and that's just and this is and you can make the argument, and it has been made, that, you know, that early Buddhism was very empirically based, because what the Buddha was doing was he was analyzing. And this is what all good Indian philosophy does is it starts with, okay, what are our means of knowledge, and perception and inference are pretty much every school almost accepts those two.
Right.
And so what does perception tell us? Well, they're physical forms. We have sensations, there's perceptions, there's consciousness. And so this whole dependent arising, and that's what people could argue that Madhyamaka was trying to return to this original idea that
Yeah.
what it's all about is dependent arising. So that somehow the later Abhidharmikas got it wrong when they started to try to find the essence of things, these
Atomic
kind of
constituents.
atomic,
Yeah.
the building blocks that they can put together. And you say, well, that kind of goes against
Ultimate
the whole.
dhammas.
Yeah,
Wait, hold
exactly. And
on.
becomes another thing to grasp onto, right? Because it's like, okay, sure, there's no self, there's no Atman, but I can grasp onto these elements. And so somehow peeling back the empirical to get to some kind of foundational reality becomes just another type of grasping. So I think that kind of, and I found with the phenomenological approach that I could take a very kind of light touch, and I do this in my other writing too, is I try not to come down too heavy on theory, because people get really caught up in theory, and something might be trendy for a decade or two, and then it's not, right? And so if I I
Right.
think that we need some theory, and it's it would be disingenuous if I didn't talk about what my theoretical commitments are. But at the same time, by trying to provide thick descriptions of things that might kind of have a longer shelf life for people than if I came down very kind of heavy-handed. And so I think the phenomenology allows you to hold things lightly enough, and to kind of do justice to them, so that future researchers might be able to find something useful from the data. Yeah. So that was a theoretical approach.
Yeah, and unsurprisingly, I'm very sympathetic to that approach, and I think
Cool.
everything you said there is a good way to go about things, and also the
Yeah.
interpretation of the text and the tradition and the evolution. Disclosing my theoretical commitments.
Yeah.
if I had any, I would label myself a Madhyamaka. So,
Right. Preaching to the
um,
choir, right? Yeah.
preaching to the choir here. Yeah.
Yep. Mhm.
The sermon to the converted. It's not wasted. It's I enjoy it.
Well, that's good for me
Um,
too.
um, so maybe you could just give folks an orientation, because I know some people will be listening to this who are not particularly well versed or versed at all in kind of classical Buddhist descriptions of the powers, how those come about, how they're developed, what are they, what's there. They may be more familiar with contemporary accounts of psychical phenomena, etc. But maybe you could provide just in brief what that looks
Yeah.
like in classical Buddhism.
Yeah. And this is part of, I think, the first chapter that after my introduction, where I talk about the paranormal in Indian Buddhism. I think part of that too is and there are people that have come before me that have done this, but really pointing out how central these psychic abilities and powers are in Buddhism right from the get-go. And I also try to place that within the larger context of Indian philosophy and religion, because going all the way back to the Vedic sources, there's a very long entrenched idea that mental discipline, particularly concentration, can lead to psychic abilities, and it was just kind of accepted as a given. And there was also recognized that certain individuals have particular aptitude, either through karma or usually from the Buddhist context, it's something related to karma, like previous practice in previous lives, for example. But so you find it particularly in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. There's accounts of these like and there's different names for them. The Buddhists, they're Abhijñas or Abhiñas, or you can call them Siddhis, or but there's this general idea that through the practice of concentration, one can attain certain abilities, and some of these abilities, and this goes all the way back to earliest accounts of like the Buddha's enlightenment, that when he was sitting under the tree, one of the first things that he was able to do was he was able to recollect his past lives, as far back as he wanted, right? And samsara is beginningless, so that's a long that's a long time. That's a long time. But this is very important, and people don't realize, because there's also this book is, I don't know if you pick this up at all, but there's a little bit in here in my book. It's a pushback against this kind of contemporary Buddhist practice that wants to strip all these sort of elements.
It's a scrubbing. It's a detraditionalization, demythologization.
Yeah, it's kind of Stephen Batchelor Buddhism, where let's get rid of rebirth, get rid of karma. Don't need that. That's just all, religious kind of added bits.
Dispensable.
Yeah, and if you're going on if you're actually looking at what the Buddhist text and the Buddhist tradition says, that's not the case. And why this is important is because this is exactly why, talking about that empirical base to Buddhism, this is exactly why that for Buddhists, the karma and rebirth is not just a dogma, because the Buddha actually experienced directly through his attainment of this, through his practice of concentration, this ability to recollect, and so this is, in some ways, this is right. This is an altered state of consciousness. This is a paranormal event.
Mm-hmm.
He's recalling memories of past lives. And then the next thing he was able.
Contemporary practitioners today do this, sometimes systematically.
Absolutely, yeah,
in
absolutely.
the Pawak Forest Monastery in Myanmar, you can go and they will train you in the jhanas and how to recollect your past lives. I know people who have done that training.
Yeah, and it's kind of in the Theravada tradition and in the Tibetan tradition, and there's a few accounts in this book. There's there's spontaneous cases, but then there's also people that talk about how they were on retreat and they did the traditional, very traditional, which is really interesting for me, because I talk about it in the preface of my book. My personal interest was, I got interested in hypnosis when I was 16 years old. I found a little book in the basement of our house on scientific autosuggestion. It was basically self-hypnosis. And I read this and I was fascinated by it, and I started doing experiments with my friends, and we could do all kinds of fun things like, hypnotize the other person to think that their hands were stuck to the table and fun things like that. And then one night I thought, okay, well, I'd heard of this regression, hypnotic regression, how people could remember their past lives through hypnotic regression. So I thought, okay, I'm going to give this a try. So I laid down in bed and I started thinking about, okay, now I'm 15, and then thinking about things that happened when I was 15, and now I'm 14, now I'm 13, and I got all the way down to like when I was 1 year old. And it was really interesting because I was laying in bed and my arms and legs are kind of moving around like I was just like a baby. And part of my mind was like, perfectly aware that I was, 16-year-old and where I was and everything. But this other part of me, it was almost like I tapped into some deeper, neural structures in my brain or something like that. And all of a sudden this blue duck, just like a ducky toy, just like flashed in front of me, like completely visual. And it was so startling that it just snapped me out of the whole thing. And then, so intrigued, I asked my mother about it the next day, and at first she couldn't remember, but then she was like, "Oh yeah, you had a little blue ducky when you were 1 year old that you used to play with in the tub." No pictures of it anywhere. There never any mention of it or anything. And then, fast forward to my first year as an undergraduate at Grinnell College, and I'm taking a introduction to psychology class, and which is sort of team taught, and so our cognitive psychologist is in there, and he's saying, "Oh, what are what are people's earliest memories, and he was expecting them all to be like 5 or 6 years old, because he was a schema theorist.
Hmm.
And schema theory, you need a map, right, before you can start making. You need a cognitive map of things before you can start making memories. So
You couldn't
people
just
don't
have
have.
those bare sense impressions embedded in
No,
there.
eidetic memory just doesn't exist. And so I put my hand up and said I have a memory from when I was one, and then how, and I explained how, and then you could hear you can hear the crickets chirping, and
Crickets.
yeah, and the dust, the and it and I was and then like a week after this happened, I was reading a book, Edward Kanza's book. I think it was called Buddhist Scriptures. It's like and where he translates
Hmm.
selected passages,
I've seen
and he
that book
described yeah, and he described
in
in that
monastic
book,
libraries.
yeah, and he describes in there, he translates an account of a monk who's given instruction to go and recall your past life. And it's the exact same technique that you go and you have
Yeah.
your morning
Yep.
meal, you
Yep.
sit down, you think about what you did an hour ago, and then 2 hours ago,
Follow
and
it
then
back.
yesterday, and then the day before.
Yep.
And then that's when I realized that there's a kind of accepted discourse science, and then there are things that that Buddhist masters figured out, that, and maybe they knew some things that we don't know, and also I realized that it wasn't okay just to speak your own truth, because if in certain circles, because if it goes against what's the accepted discourse, it was just going to be, that deafening silence was, they might as well
Sure.
just, I talk about them as, it was louder than screaming heretic and burning me at the stake. um and so I think that, and so then,
Or leave aside truth, even just saying I had this experience. I'm not lying. This happened to me.
right,
Just
right.
nothing.
But then also the veracity of that, like that there's some validity to your personal experience, and rather than just saying that these things. But the
Right.
thing was, it wasn't even engaged with, because that goes against the theory. So
Yep.
because if the data doesn't fit the
Yep.
theory, then we throw out the data, and it's like,
Well, the data
well, is
must be
that,
wrong.
yeah, the data must be wrong, right, right. But you accumulate enough anomalies, and then all of a sudden they're not. Then you've got a problem, right, with with the model, right? So
You have a paradigmatic crisis in Kuhnian
ex-
terms.
exactly right. And so you need a revolution there. So getting back to this whole thing, that yeah, so the Buddha, so he had that. So that's precognition. We call that precognition, right? Recollection of this past lives. And then the next thing that happened was he was able to see the workings of karma of other beings. And that's what we would call clairvoyance, right? And so this confirmed these doctrines of karma and rebirth, and so these were really important. And then another really important power that comes up quite a bit was it's the ability to read other people's thoughts or hear other people's thoughts, what we would call telepathy. And
Yep.
this was very
Yep.
important in the Buddhist tradition too, because this was the only way that you could really confirm someone's, whether someone had attained nirvana, like had destroyed the cankers, had achieved. And Buddha used this as a um, pedagogically, right? Because if someone comes to see him and he can read their thoughts right away, of course he's going to be able to tell them exactly what they need to hear in order to progress spiritually on the path. So my little Shih Tzu has come over to say hello. So yeah. So then on top of that, there are other abilities that they're what kind of more shh, quiet. There are other more like psychic powers and whatnot, magical abilities that the Buddha was able to attain, uh, levitating, flying, dividing himself. There's the miracle of twins, where his lower half turns into fire and his upper half turns into water. And so it gets quite what maybe moderns would say is fantastical, but yet important part of the tradition, because the Buddha, and again, the Buddha made it clear that this wasn't just to impress people, but it was used for pedagogical effect. Sometimes you could really grab people's attention with something fantastic like this, and then use it as a teaching tool. And so these elements, what we call like supernatural or psychic elements, go all the way back to the earliest strata of Buddhism, and then and then you get to Mahayana, and then it's a bit like that on steroids, where it gets very elaborate.
Boom.
Yeah, with the bodhisattva. I mean, bodhisattvas, advanced bodhisattvas are kind of godlike beings who are able to do, multiply themselves limitless times,
Yeah.
travel throughout all time and space, and then this ties into
The Vimalakirti Sutra is an excellent example of this. Not that long, worth reading.
yeah, it's very worthwhile just to get access to it. And I think that because I've studied the Supreme Array for so long, and I for me it I kind of see it as a kind of apogee of bringing together um, all these different all these different kind of philosophical concepts of the interpenetration of time and space, and magical abilities, and the Buddhist path, and so that's all discussed in my kind of historical chapter, which I really, again, I focused on Indian Buddhism because that's the area that I specialize in, but that's also where Buddhism began. And so these ideas about psychic powers and the paranormal then move with Buddhism as it travels throughout the rest of Asia, and to Southeast Asia, and then into China and things like that. And they become adapted and adopted to local beliefs and practices and cultures, but they never go away. And so then that's kind of lead into then a chapter that I spend looking at the Western kind of scientific study of the paranormal, going back all the way to the late 19th century with the studies that were done in England and whatnot, and then also going up to governmental studies by like the CIA and remote viewing and things like that. And so these were the two, what I look at are like the two kind of formal.
I didn't know that history.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting. I mean, there's been some really interesting stuff that's been written on it. Annie Jacobs' book that I reference a lot talks a lot about this stuff. So, and so the paranormal. I mean, in the Western tradition, especially in academia and things, has always been a kind of fringe element. But I mean, this the CIA definitely took it very seriously, and there are the research that's been done by J.B. Rhine and carried on by other people like Charles Tart, where they bring this stuff into the lab, which and I think Tart makes a really good he makes a really good point where the meta-analysis on all these studies that have been done, where premonition and picking, random number picking and things like that, they show that statistically they show that there's something significant going on. And so the skeptics like to say, oh, then there must be something wrong with the statistics. But he's like, well, then we're in big trouble, because we use the same statistics to do drug trials and and things like that. So what's interesting for me about that is it shows that it seems that there really is something going on in the laboratory, which tends to show like weak but definitely above chance things are going on with certain things, with precognition and telepathy and things like that. So these are the two kind of discourses. You have the traditional Buddhist discourse, and then you have the contemporary scientific study of the paranormal. And then that kind of leads into my own research, where I look at people's actual accounts of their different experiences. And I say that in some way it kind of provides a lot more nuance and complexity um, outside of these two kind of formal discourses. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously, if you want all the details of those cases, and they're for like phenomenological case studies and narrative case studies of contemporary practitioners who, through diligent practice um, or spontaneously, just have had these events arise in their practice, in their dreams, in their lives around stressful or in intense events, or just sometimes out of the blue. Um, if you want a lot of that, go get the book.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering for you, what in your mind, in all of that research, stuck out, and what, yeah, just maybe pick a few, or elements of a few that really stuck out for you and has had a lasting impact. Maybe for you in your own views of things, or yeah.
Yeah. My I'll talk about my two favorite because they really, I think they really made an impression on me, and they also make a point which I try to make in the book, that there's a whole range, right? People have a whole range of experiences where, sometimes and in the survey they'll be like, when they were asked a number of questions. Have you ever had, sense that there was presence, in the room, or something, or have you ever felt like something was going to happen and then it did happen, and things like that. And then they were asked to elaborate on that, and some people were like, "Oh, I had a dream and then it came true." It doesn't really give you a lot. It doesn't really give you a lot of content, right? And so you're like, okay, yeah, maybe, maybe, but then people will be like, "Well, I had a dream, and then somebody else had the same dream," and then they give you like specific details of things that happened, and then it becomes a lot more intriguing, right? And so again, using that kind of idea that things are more or less probable, that some things are a lot more interesting, and especially when more than one person is involved, when specific details are given. And then so I think I think there's always an element of wishful thinking. There's always an element of fantasy. There's always a possibility of someone being deluded or hallucinating. And so I think that these all these things happen,
Hmm.
um, like on a spectrum. And so again, that you can say, okay, some things that is more likely to have been something that would be paranormal, or more likely to have a more like mundane kind of explanation. And I've had things happen to me in my own life that fit that within that, like that was weird, but maybe has a natural explanation I don't know about. That was really weird, and I can't think of anything that has a natural. And so, and the other thing about these experiences is sometimes they're very impactful, and I make the argument that even if you don't believe that they are true, they are impactful enough that they can change the course of a person's life, and I think that alone is reason to take them seriously. And
Absolutely.
so the example that I like to give,
Yeah.
is when I was interviewing Rick Rapetti. He talked about how he had a out of body experience when he was like 17 years old, that like changed the course of his life, and he got very into yoga and meditation. Had many different paranormal experiences, but he kind of went through that phase, and then that kind of ended, and then he kind of moved into the sort of next phase of his life, and he was living in New York City. He was delivering oil. He's driving one of these big trucks, oil trucks, and he was delivering oil. That was his job. Um, um, but one night he had this dream that he was with his cousin, who he was good friends with, who was in his oil truck with him, and the truck crashed. It was in an accident. It was a very vivid dream, and he woke up, and it kind of stuck with him. And so he was talking to his auntie on the phone, and he said, "Oh, I had the weirdest dream that I was with we'll call him Vinny, okay? I was with Vinny, her son, his cousin, and the truck crashed." And she was like, "You got to talk to Vinny." And so he's like, "Okay." So he put him on the phone, And Rick describes his dream, and Vinny had the same dream. So they both had the same dream, that they were in Rick's oil truck and the truck crashed. And so okay, that was weird, right? Year goes by, they both forget about it. And then one day, Rick, the place where he worked, some of the young guys would show up in the mornings and they would ask, can I tag along with the oil truck and I'll help you? And, they get paid, $50 for a day or whatever. And Rick usually didn't like to do that because a person would slow him down. But he was having trouble. The front end of his truck, there was a problem with it. So he brought his truck back to the shop, and his cousin was there. And he was like, "Oh, I'm so glad you came back because I need to make some money. And come on, you're my cousin. Please, please, please." And it's like, "Oh, okay, you can ride with me." So, they fix his truck, gets out on the road, but they actually hadn't fixed the problem. And like the front end of it comes off and it shreds the front tire. And Rick looks over at his cousin and he's like, "This is
Yoink.
it. This is the dream." And he knew, and what was interesting too is he knew from the dream that if he didn't hold on to that steering wheel as tight as he could, they would crash and they would die. And so he had to hold on to it as tight as he could. Eventually he lost control. The truck crashed into an embankment. His cousin went through the windshield just like he had in the dream. It luckily survived,
Oh my God.
without he wasn't disabled, thankfully. But after this happened, Rick was like, how is this possible, right? How is it possible that we both have a dream? It came true a year later, just as we both dreamt it. And what does this mean about free will, right? Because if you think about, the butterfly effect and all the choices that in a year's time in between
Sure.
that could have led to a different outcome to have
Right.
this happen. And so then he ended up going back
Sure.
to school and doing his PhD in philosophy. And now he's one of the world's leading authorities on Buddhism and free will. He's written, he's single authored books on it and edited volumes and articles and whatnot. And so this changed the course of his life. Interesting thing is he still can't explain how something like this can happen. But, and that's and that that's what intrigues me, because this event, we talk about dreams. Some people, the way our culture looks at dreams is that they're just like brain farts, right? They're just like things that happen at night, or maybe our brains
Right.
defragging or whatever, but it's not real because it's all happening inside your head. But it seems to me that, and especially if you look at non-Western cultures, that when we dream, it's like our ordinary senses go offline, and I think it allows that other information can
Yeah.
sometimes kind of filter through. And it changed the course of his life. And so that's a real prominent example. And another one I really like to give is one of the people that I interviewed. Her name is Angela Sumegi, who's also a scholar of Buddhism. She's retired now, but she's Canadian, but she grew up in Jamaica. And when she was a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, they lived in a big old house in Jamaica. And her bedroom was down the hall from her parents' bedroom, and she was falling asleep, or she'd fallen asleep, and then she heard this loud pounding noise, and she opened her eyes, and in her doorway there was this horrible monster with 3 eyes and fangs and dreadlocks, and was holding the staff and was pounding the staff against the wooden floor, and she could hear it reverberating. And she's like, she's like a little girl. She's like, this is a monster, he's going to eat me. So she pulls the covers over her head and she's shivering there with fright. And then the sound seems to fade away, and she looks over her covers and it's gone. And there's still this echoing sound of the staff from pounding on the floor. And so she jumps up and she runs into her parents' bedroom, because she was terrified. And then, fast forward 15 years or so, just completely forgotten about it. And she talks about there was no place to put that, right? It wasn't related to any books she'd seen. They didn't even have a TV. She knew nothing
Sure.
about Buddhism at all. It was just some random monster. And so she she's studying, and she's in Canada, and she's studying for an undergraduate degree, and she's interested in religion and Asian philosophy and things like that. And she's in her professor's office, and she's flipping through a book of tankas, Tibetan tankas, and she comes across one, and
Yeah.
it's the monster. It's the monster. It's like perfectly the monster. It's got the
Sure.
3 eyes and the dreadlocks and the fangs and everything. And it was Mahakala, right? It was the Avalokiteshvara, the protector,
Yeah.
in his
I figured.
in his fierce form. And she was like, "This is the monster." And so what does she do? She goes on and she gets her PhD in Buddhism, in Tibetan Buddhism and art. And her first book is on, I think it's called something like Dream Worlds. And it's kind of a comparative study of Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan shamanism. And she's also had other experiences, really interesting kind of out of body experiences too. But again, something that happened to somebody, um, doesn't have a real like rational explanation according to this kind of scientific physicalism or something, but yet changes the course of a person's life. And so I think these were two really good cases, at least for me, that made me think that yeah, there really is something going on here that's worth paying attention to. And then I think a really important point that I also try to make is that these things, and I think this is really also the two examples I think is important because it points out, one of them is precognition, um, a precognitive dream, and the other one is an encounter. And I have a whole section on, just encounters with other beings, and these things go back all the way to the earliest, time of Buddhism, and they're still happening now. Like
Yeah.
people have this. I think sometimes there's this
Certainly
bit of
are.
this there's this bit of a hangover, yeah, as you would know, right? There's this kind of view that like, okay, these accounts are kind of pious embellishment. And maybe they are, right? Because Buddhist texts, they function, they have a rhetorical purpose, right? And so they're meant to persuade people and convert people. And so you can obviously say that, you know, we can't just read everything that happens in Buddhist texts as face value. This just happened as historical fact. But I think that, but at the same time, you can't just dismiss these encounters and these experiences as not possible because just a priori they're not possible. And the thing is, like, on the ground with real modern contemporary practitioners, these things, they continue to happen. And so, and I talk about how what happens often is that once you start talking to people, you find that families often have stories that get passed down, and because when weird things happen to people that they're afraid they're going to be judged for, stigmatized for, what they'll do is they will tell the people that they are closest to and their families, because there's the people that they trust. And also, I point out that even though we have these kind of laboratory studies where the paranormal is really prominent is like out in the wild, like out in the real world, and often again during these very intense experiences of like people dying or being very ill, or altered states of consciousness, or something life altering is happening, when someone dies, say, having some kind of apparitional encounter with them and things like that. And so, but if you think that, oh, only all that is anecdotal and so it's not worth paying attention to, um, you're missing a whole lot. And I think I was really inspired in part by the work that Jeffrey Kripo has done in this regard, because someone who started out as a scholar of Hinduism and then moved into this area, and I think that he makes a great he was a real inspiration. He was actually one of the reviewers for the book that I wrote on non-dual who contacted me afterwards. And so, I've been sort of having a friendly email exchange with him, and he's been really inspirational for the groundbreaking work that he's done in the paranormal. And I highly recommend, people who are interested in this. And I think the part of what I see my research in is, as a specialist in Buddhism, contributing to that kind of larger discussion that seems to be opening up now, whereas that these things are not just being pushed aside as, oh, they don't happen, so they can't be real, sort of thing. So yeah, so I think it's kind of a long-winded answer, but I think that gives a little taster of some of the
That was
things
a
that.
good answer. It was a great answer.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
No, that was. I think that those examples well furnishes people to see if that was interesting to you. There's a lot more in there.
Yeah, yeah, and that was some of the best. That was
So
some of the
I
best
guess
stuff. But
we're coming up a little over an hour now.
yep.
So maybe just briefly future research, and then I think there's one or two audience questions that weren't covered in what we've talked about already. So maybe
Okay.
we could rapid fire those. But for
Okay.
now, future research, what
Yeah.
implications? Where would you like to see this kind of thing go?
Yeah. I mean, um, what I'm hoping is that, like, the book will help open the conversation a bit more. And I think that there's, even within Buddhism, there's for scholars of Buddhism, there's Buddhism is such a rich tradition. So it would be great to see that people who specialize in Buddhism, kind of on the ground in different areas. Maybe this will open some doors and make it easier to talk about the paranormal, say maybe like as it happens in Thailand or in China or in Japan or wherever. I mean, it was interesting when I was talking with Columbia about coming up
Right.
with a title for the book, and they were like, well, they were kind of, you know, uh, they were kind of concerned that, this is just another book about, this, you know, white people, kind of appropriating, Buddhism. And I was like, well, it is converts, but part of that, it was, I'm not trying to say that, like, white Anglo American people are Buddhists are more important than other kind of Buddhists. But because my survey was in English, and because that's the language I speak, that most of the people that are going to respond are going to be English speakers, and I'm kind of an insider to this culture. And so, but it was important for them to signal that this is, convert Buddhist communities. But Buddhism is not a static thing, and it doesn't, like, Indian Buddhism is not more Buddhist than contemporary American Buddhism. It's all just different kinds of Buddhism. So I I'm looking at convert Buddhist experience, but what I'm hoping is that maybe that can be expanded out to other Buddhists throughout the world, and then not just Buddhism, but starting to take the paranormal just more seriously. And then I talk about in my conclusion that I think phenomenology is not only is a great lens to look at the paranormal, but it's also a really good way of approaching um, human knowledge that can begin to break down some of these barriers between the humanities and the social sciences and the hard sciences, because there's this kind of hierarchy that's
Right.
been established, right? That hard sciences are, like physics is whatever is at the top, and then you get your softer sciences, and then your humanities, and they're somehow less important. Hence the fact that I'm out of a job. I'm out of a job now, right? Because obviously what I do is not important to the capitalist endeavor. Um, and so and so I think phenomenology, I try to make an argument for the fact that we can use this kind of ideas about the life world and this ideas about this kind of radically empirical approach to break down this barrier, because there's this kind of with physicalism, there's this idea that there's the world of facts over here, and then there's the world of meaning over here. And the world of meaning is not really that important, because it's somehow it's not
Right.
as
Entirely
real.
divorced.
Yeah,
What?
and it's not as real. Like, this mug is more real than the love I have for my children, right? Because that's just psychological. That's like, well, if someone didn't love
Well,
us,
that's just feelings.
yeah, those are
What?
feelings. They don't, and it's like, if someone didn't love us, none of us would be here, right? Because we come into this world completely helpless. So if someone didn't love it, and so it's like,
Someone fed us, cared for us.
yeah, and nurtured us,
They're
and those ideas and physical things don't exist. And phenomenology does that. And it's a good way of critiquing science by looking at what is the culture of science, what is the culture of the lab, and how science is done by human beings, and human beings aren't disinterested from their research funding. And it was really interesting, when 50 years ago they came out and they said, sugar is fine, fat is bad, right? So we're like, oh, okay. So we drank low fat milk, and we had margarine. And it's like, well, who was funding that research? Well, it turns out, oh, like Kellogg's was funding that research. That's really that's really
Ooh.
interesting. That's like,
Hmm.
so that isn't just fact-based research. It's like, well, it turns out that fat's not so bad for you, but sugar really you know, I taught for several years. I taught critical thinking. At our, we have a core course in critical thinking at Massey now, and this idea that science, that science is somehow divorced. So phenomenology, I think, and 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 in some ways the paranormal is a kind of flashpoint, because it's like, when things happen like that happened to Rick or happened to
Yeah.
Angela, and if you're going to really be kind of honest as a human being, you have to say, okay, these things, they do matter, but like, how do they matter? And if that's true, maybe this hard and
Right.
fast line that we draw between human emotions and interpretation and hermeneutics and psychology and the physical world isn't so hard and fast. So I think that that's what I'm hoping. um
Right.
I'm myself personally, I'm kind of retiring from the academy, but I plan to continue writing. I just recently published my memoirs. But I've been self-publishing since 2016, which I find is a really great outlet to, I use Amazon Kindle, and I like it because I don't need all the academic scaffolding and go through all the BS of peer review. I can just get ideas kind of directly out there, and then you can maintain complete um, control over the material too. So I wrote a book on modern Samkhya, which is Samkhya is an Indian philosophy, and it's like my most, it's a little book. It's only 60, 70 pages, and includes a translation, my own translation from the Sanskrit. Samkhyakarika's in it, and meditational exercises. It's a bit like how people have adopted mindfulness in Buddhism as a kind of therapeutic. I said, well, you could do this with other Indian philosophies, and here's an example. And it's very popular on Amazon, and it's even been cited in the scholarly literature, which I find really interesting, because not with an academic press, not peer reviewed, and then it's like appearing in academic academic publications,
Sure.
sometimes criticizing, but
But if the
some,
research is good,
yeah, and I'm just like, great, great. So that's kind of the direction I'm going in, and so I think, like with what I recently published, on just on my own sort of life story, it was fun, because I kind of mix and match this. I kind of blur the distinction between fiction and nonfiction, but I also talk about, I talk about paranormal stuff, but more from like my own, because I touch on that in the last chapter of my book. But I think I'll be doing a lot more like that, either writing fiction or self-help, or sorry, my puppy just stole my necklace, decided he was going to chew on that. No. Yeah, so that's probably the direction I'll be going in. I don't know if I'll be doing, more academic stuff on this. I tend to, once it's sort of like, I have, this is this, once this comes, when this happens, it's kind of like, oh, I'm kind of done. I've always had this thing about, I don't want to really be a one-trick pony,
Something else would be good for a while.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of, I had my
Right.
say, let people read it, and then, and they can add to it. But what I'm hoping it'll do is it'll start to it'll allow people to get over some of the stigma, because this is what I found with the whole psychedelics too, that when you stigmatize a whole realm of human experience, you try to ignore it, we're just missing out. And I'm always I'm always that person where someone says don't
Yeah.
go there, like I want to go. Like the first thing I want to do, don't go there, you're not allowed. The first thing I want to do is like, I want to go, I want to
Sure.
go there. Don't talk about, don't talk about
No,
psychedelics.
well, of
Yeah,
course. Well,
yeah,
there must be
yeah.
something interesting there.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not supposed to. Yeah, I'm from that Generation X where parents were like, come back at dinner time, when we just went out and did whatever the hell we wanted. And so I'm just like, not supposed to go there. Okay, I'm going to go there. So I did, I've done that. So, yeah. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that it'll inspire people, and it'll allow people to talk more freely about these things, and to bring to bear, because I don't think that we don't we don't need to suspend our analytical critical judgment, but we need to bring it to bear on these things and make it okay to talk about, so we can say, like, I'll say, yeah, like, I had some experiences and it was weird, but maybe maybe it was just has a completely mundane explanation, and then other times where things happen where I'm not so sure. And if someone can, someone read the book and say, okay, you think that this was paranormal, but here's an explanation, and I might be like, wow, that's great. Okay, now I understand, right? And I think that having that open mind about it, it's just like, let's talk about it, and let's try to figure it out, and let's get over this whole, like, it's
Right. Rather
amazing
than just
how,
ignore it.
yeah, and like how, like, humanities people, like, with the whole psychedelics thing, it's like, I wrote this book in 2016, and I've contacted people that, there's been the whole, renaissance, and the science people, like, they don't even want to talk to me or people like me, because it's like, why? It's like, I know a whole lot about this. It's not the science, but but why are you compartmentalizing that, like, this stuff that happens to, like, real live people is so less important than the stuff that you want to do in the lab? And it's the same thing
Sure.
with, like, why is somebody's experiences,
Right.
like, having a precognitive dream that comes true? Why is that? Because you can't, because that stuff you'll never reproduce in a lab, because you can't. So, but does that mean it's not real? Hardly. So yeah. So that's my hope for the
No.
future. We'll see if if the entire civilization doesn't collapse before then. And this could be a way of
Well,
helping whatever comes next, is that, like, realizing that, um I just I just think there's so much more depth to life and just being aware of that, the depth and complexity of it, and injecting a bit more of that, mystery back into it, because I think I went through, I think as many people in my generation and others went through, that there was this kind of disenchantment that we went through, that we were taught that all those stories and things were not
right.
true, and these things don't happen, and then the world becomes this really cold, lifeless, place, where then you start realizing, well, actually, you know
Produce, consume, produce, consume, produce,
yeah,
consume.
yeah, and it's like people have been encountering, other beings, like, forever, and it's just like, if we're maybe it's because, I was a fan of the Narnia books, At the end of the last one, all the dwarves are in this little cabin, which becomes a doorway to this whole new Narnia and this paradise. And all they see is this like dirty stable. And they try to, other people try to take them out and they just bang their heads against the wall because and they're the skeptics, right? Because they're just like, no, we are in this stable. There is nothing special that's happening here. And everyone's just heading off into this like amazing paradise. And I'm just kind of like, wake up and look around because it's weird. It's weird and it's wondrous. And I think a lot of that fear, a lot of the dogmatism and fear are closely related to each other. It's like it's too scary for me to acknowledge that there are all these things that are beyond what I can understand and therefore can control and manipulate. So I'm just going to say that they don't happen because then I can, yeah, exactly what you said. I can kind of go back to the consensus trance and, watch my Netflix and work my 40 hours a week and, whatever. So, yeah.
Right.
So I think
The consensus
probably
trance. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, and I have to give credit to that. I got that from Charles Tart, who I think is like the master of, he wrote, he has an edited volume, Altered States, that came out, probably close to a half century now, where he talks about, that there is no, he spent decades and decades studying altered states, and he came to the conclusion, which I accept, is that there is no normal waking state of consciousness, that what people consider normal is a kind
Right.
of consensus trance that you've been,
Yeah.
because our, everything,
A narrow band.
yeah, it's a very narrow band, and, and it's always changing based on our, our state of consciousness, based on our diet, based on our emotions, based on our hormones, based on our sleep patterns, based on our cultural expectations, based on our language. And so when you can suspend that, or at least imaginatively step outside of that, then it opens up all kinds of realms of possibility. Yeah. So
That it does.
great.
Wonderful. Shall we go through a couple of audience questions and
Oh
then
yes,
close it out?
sure. Yeah, sure.
Okay, this one is from Jess. The question is, how much do powers overlap with practice, if at all? Can practice cause powers? And she writes, my sense is it basically doesn't. It's only that practice can help uncover latent energies in any area of the being. Always looking for disconfirmation of this theory, though. So there's parts of the book which speak directly to that cultivation of powers. So
Yeah, I had I was fortunate to interview in my book a contemporary Theravada Buddhist monk who's part of the forest tradition, and he was able to give a lot of insight, especially contemporary understandings of traditional sources. And through those discussions, I think your answer is partly right, that a lot of it from the Buddhist point of view will come through is karmic, right? Your previous practice, but it also comes through concentration. So it's the practice is like particularly practicing the jhanas, right? Practicing the different stages of concentration, meditation, and that's bigger than Buddhism. You find that in this idea of samadhi in the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and this was widely accepted. But some people have, and the way that I talk about it is a bit like uh, uh, an athlete or like a chess player. Like I like to play chess for fun, but I could play chess for 12 hours a day, and I'm never going to be like a grandmaster. The same thing with say tennis. You could there's a certain amount of natural ability, but very intense practice in the right way will increase that ability. And I think it's the same thing in Buddhism, this with the supernormal powers, that there's a certain natural aptitude combined with a certain level of practice. And so just because you might practice the jhanas, or practice samatha 10 hours every day for months and months and months, and not have any not develop any kind of psychic powers, um, or you might be a natural and just practice very little. But the idea is that that practicing concentration meditation will will amplify these abilities. And so it's kind of like this idea that if you're karmically ripe, and generally the idea is that people with a who have a natural aptitude um, have done this practice in the past. I talk about this with Rick. The chapter I have with him is called the Yogin, and he seemed to, from a very young age as a teenager, just very easily fall into extremely deep levels of trance. And I was like, well, kind of why do you think that is? It's just maybe from past life. I mean, modern researchers like Dean Radin might say that it's genetic, and it does seem psi does seem to have
Sure.
some kind of genetic disposition, that there are people and it seems to run in families. And it's funny because he did a study, I saw it in an interview, I think it was on YouTube, but I think they published an article about it, where they're trying to find a kind of genetic marker for psi, and what they needed was a control group. And they found that it was much harder to find a control. They wanted a control group. They never had anything paranormal happen to that person, and nor anything paranormal happen in that person's family, like any family history. And it was harder for them to find the control group than it was to find the test group. But what he did find was that Western Europeans tended to have the least amount of psi in the family, and their working hypothesis was the witch trials eliminated a lot of natural psi when they killed when the Inquisition wiped those people out. So I think that, and also the U.S. government had the same. This was a big debate in the U.S. government when they were studying, like when the CIA and the Defense Department was studying remote viewing. There were two camps. One of them was it's natural, it can't be developed, and the other camp was no, it can definitely be trained. And I take the middle. Being a good Buddhist, I take the middle path, and I whether you want to see it as genetics or whether you want to see it as karma. And it's not necessarily either or, right? Because your karma decides what family you were born into. So maybe your karma decided you would be born into a family that has a genetic history of psychic abilities because of your previous practice of concentration. So I'm not saying, whatever the reason, the general Buddhist view, I would say, is that there is some natural ability that can be amplified through practice of concentration, but that practicing concentration alone does not guarantee that these things will happen. And I found also in my own experience too that is the case, that I have had some experiences that I think that were amplified during periods where I was more intensively practicing. So that was a long-winded answer, but I hopefully a useful
Yeah.
hopefully a useful one. Yeah.
I think so. I think that'll clarify it. It was pretty that covered it. So yeah, I think you covered the other ones here
Okay.
already in what we've talked about.
Great.
But were there any stories regarding supernatural mathematical ability? This one is coming from a mathematician friend. Well, not a mathematician professionally, but someone who is really into mathematics. Friend of mine. Any stories like that come up?
Oh,
Cities for the purpose of math.
it was really interesting. They didn't make it into the book, but I interviewed one person in New Zealand who had it wasn't a direct like parent, and this is why it didn't come into the book. It was really fascinating. But they'd had I'm trying to think whether I think it might have been induced through either psilocybin or LSD. But they were someone that studies like math and science, and they were able to yeah, I think they had this kind of breakthrough where they were able to conceptualize kind of visually like certain like rather advanced um mathematical formulas. And so it was and then
Sure. Yeah.
and I think it might have been I don't think it was much more than just a kind of one-off psychedelic experience. It was kind of like the psychedelics triggered something deeper
Mm.
that was really kind of like
Uh-huh.
life altering, but not anything that could be put into a specific category of this is
Right.
clairvoyance, this is telepathy, this is something, but it was very life altering, and it seemed to also function on that very like that it tapped into his very like abstract theoretical mathematical mind in a way that allowed him to model things that he previously hadn't been able to. So so um, I would say that
Right. Yeah.
you're onto something there, but it doesn't make it into the book. But I do have that kind of I have met someone where that was definitely the case. Yeah, yeah,
Okay. That
cool.
that's all. Thank you so much for answering the questions, my own, and those few from the audience. If people want to find you, your work, I believe you have a website people can
Yep,
find.
yep. It's just douglasosto.com. Yeah, so it's pretty easy to find. Yeah, so you can get in touch with me there. I'm
Okay.
always
Um,
happy to talk to people about this kind of stuff. Yeah, so yeah, it was great. It was great, Winston. It was lots of fun. It's nice it's nice to get to talk to you again, and it's nice to get sort of that follow up on the work. I really work hard on trying to you know I really value the contributors, and so I really work hard at making sure that I portray people the way that is a way that it, does justice to their experience. And so and I did check with everybody afterwards, but it's nice to talk to people to have that follow up. So yeah, so that's cool, because I mean the work wouldn't, I mean it's really without them this
yeah.
it just wouldn't happen. And yeah, and so yeah, it means a lot to me that that I respectfully kind of tell these people's stories in a way that works for them. So
That comes through. Yeah, in all of your interactions with me, I'm sure for everyone else that was a contributor or an interview subject for the book. So thank you for doing the work.
great,
Okay,
great.
I think
Yeah,
that's
let's get
all.
out. Yep.
Take
All
care,
right,
everybody. Thanks so
signing
much for
off.
listening.
Yep.
Bye bye.
Take care. Bye bye.